Welcome to the deep dive. If you use the internet, and I mean, let's face it, of course you do, you are standing right in the middle of a massive global regulatory storm. And this isn't just about protecting kids. It's about a fundamental worldwide pivot towards, well, mandatory age verification and digital ID.
And that's reshaping the digital rights of every single user.
Exactly.
That's the core tension we're going to get into today. Our mission is to unpack three simultaneous, really unprecedented attempts across Australia, the EU, and the US to impose age limits and, maybe more importantly, force users to prove who they are.
We've got sources detailing the legislation, the constitutional challenges, and frankly, the technological compliance nightmares that come with it. On the surface, the story is pretty clear. Child safety.
Right. That's an easy sell.
It is. But critics are arguing that the enforcement mechanisms, the mandatory digital ID part, are creating this global infrastructure for surveillance, for the erosion of rights for all of us.
It's a huge compliance undertaking for these platforms. They're having to build entirely new systems under some really intense pressure.
That pressure is definitely accelerating. And the trade-offs between safety and privacy,
Yeah.
I mean, they've never been higher.
For sure. And for anyone trying to track the up-to-the-minute analysis on these complex legal and privacy developments, resources are, constantly being updated, especially for organizations just trying to navigate this chaotic landscape.
So let's dive right into the most dramatic example, the one that's really setting a global precedent for just how extreme this can get. Australia's world-first social media ban.
We are tracking the countdown to December 10th, 2025.
That's the date.
That's the date the Online Safety Amendment Act 2024 takes full effect. This law mandates a minimum age of 16 for any new accounts on the big platforms: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, YouTube.
It's so important to get the language right here. Officials keep calling it an age restriction or a delay. But the immediate impact is a massive removal campaign. We already saw Meta start actively removing accounts on December 4th, well ahead of that final deadline.
And the regulatory teeth here they're sharp. The government decided to penalize the platforms, not the families.
Right, not the users themselves.
Not the users. Fines for systemic failures can claim up to AU $49.5 million. That's about, 32 million US dollars? That kind of penalty, it guarantees platforms are motivated to comply no matter what the cost.
Which leads directly to what our sources are calling the enforcement paradox.
Okay.
If a platform faces a massive fine, they need a reliable way to verify age. But the law simultaneously forbids them from using government-issued ID.
So you can't just ask for a driver's license scan.
No.
Precisely. So they are forced into implementing what the law calls reasonable steps, using a multi-layered waterfall approach, which is just regulator speak for, use whatever AI and behavioral tech you can get your hands on.
So what does that actually look like in practice? What are they doing?
We're talking about some pretty intrusive methods. Age estimation technology, which often relies on facial scanning and biometrics.
Oh, wow.
Also, age inference, drawn from your existing user data, like your posting patterns or even your friend networks, and just detailed behavioral analysis.
And this is where the privacy trade-off becomes so tangible. For every single person listening, it doesn't matter how old you are.
Right.
If the platforms can't use a government ID, they have to use this controversial AI that just doesn't work perfectly. We've seen documented error rates for biometric age verification as high as 30% in some of the early trials.
Just think about that for a second. That means for every million users they check, 300,000 people who are legally over 16 could be mistakenly locked out.
300,000?
Yes. Forced into some long, drawn-out appeal process, or they just give up access entirely.
Yeah.
You're building this massive new digital dragnet that is inherently flawed, yet it requires incredibly sensitive biometric data from every single user just to function.
It's infrastructure built on the assumption of error.
Yeah.
So let's look at the government's justification for a step this drastic.
The government rationale, and this was heavily championed by Prime Minister Albanese, it frames social media as a scourge on mental health.
I've heard that word used, yeah.
And they cite some pretty alarming statistics. Depression and anxiety among 15 to 34-year-olds in Australia, it surged from 9% in 2009 to a staggering 22% in 2022.
That's a huge jump.
It is. So they argue that setting age limits for social media is no different than, setting limits for buying alcohol or driving a car.
But the process itself was just so heavily criticized. This bill was passed in 9 days.
9 days.
They gave the public just one business day for submissions. And this isn't just about political opposition. The rush created this deep worry about the law's unintended consequences.
Absolutely. Mental health experts weighed in immediately, noting that the ban could dangerously isolate children who rely on these digital communities.
Which is particularly true for vulnerable groups, right?
Yeah.
Like LGBTQ plus youth or kids in regional and remote areas where, physical support networks are just scarce or they don't exist.
Exactly. I mean, for some kids, the internet is the only place they can find a community without fear of judgment.
That makes perfect sense.
One mental health service director pointed out that 73% of young people accessing mental health support reported doing so through social media. When you just pull the plug on that lifeline, the human cost of that isolation becomes a massive ethical and policy concern.
Which brings us to the ultimate legal battle. With the deadline so close, the stakes became constitutional. On November 27, 2025, the High Court of Australia accepted a major legal challenge.
Filed by the Digital Freedom Project and 2 teenagers.
So this isn't just about regulation anymore. It's about whether the government has overstepped its bounds on fundamental freedoms.
The core legal argument is that this blanket ban violates Australia's implied constitutional right to freedom of political communication.
Okay, let's quickly define that for listeners who aren't, steeped in Australian constitutional law. What does that implied right actually mean?
It means that while the right isn't explicitly written down, like, say, the First Amendment in the U.S., the High Court has consistently found that freedom of communication about government and political matters is necessary for a functional democracy.
If you can't talk about politics, you can't vote effectively.
That's the idea. And the plaintiffs argue that social media is now an essential forum for that exact discussion.
And the plaintiffs themselves, they really bring this to life. We have Noah Jones, he's 15, and he uses platforms like TikTok and X specifically for civic education and political discussion.
Noah's argument is pretty straightforward. Banning him from these forums silences tomorrow's voters. He is actively trying to engage in the political process, and the government is stopping him right before he's old enough to vote. It's an immediate political silencing.
Then there's Macy Nayland, also 15, who lives in a regional area. Her challenge is more about the privacy implications for all young users.
Right. Macy argues that mandatory age verification compromises her essential need for online anonymity. In a small town, being forced to prove your identity through biometrics or linked data, it makes you identifiable.
And exposed.
Exposed to local judgment or even harassment. She says the law, which is meant to protect her, actually makes her more vulnerable.
So the plaintiffs are basically arguing that the law fails the constitutional proportionality test.
Exactly. The government has to prove that the law isn't necessary and that it is proportional to the harm it's trying to prevent.
But they argue it's excessive.
They argue it's excessive and disproportionate because less restrictive alternatives are out there. They point to options like stricter parental consent requirements or imposing a duty of care obligation directly on the platforms or just prioritizing digital literacy programs instead of a hard ban.
This high court challenge, it's a global compliance moment. The outcome will determine it's an outright ban on these essential communication forms can actually withstand constitutional scrutiny. And because of the complexity and just the global implications of this legal volatility, organizations have to stay informed. That's really why resources like www.compliancehub.wiki exist to provide that real-time tracking of these massive global legal shifts.
Absolutely. So if Australia represents the nuclear option, the outright ban, let's shift across the globe to Europe.
Yeah.
They're building the technological infrastructure for control, and they're using a coordinated two-pronged approach.
And both of these initiatives were approved right around the same time, November 26, 2025. Let's start with the EU Digital Identity Wallet.
The European Parliament voted overwhelmingly to tie strict age limits to this new digital ID system. The wallet is supposed to solve the age verification paradox by allowing for selective disclosure.
So instead of handing over your whole driver's license.
Right. The wallet is designed to simply prove you are, say, over 18 or over 16 without sharing your name, your birth date, or any specific documents.
And the goal there is to enforce a floor. Users have to prove they are over 13, and they need parental consent for that 13 to 16 age bracket.
It creates an enforced identity layer across the entire internet. But then on the very same day, COREPER, that's the Committee of Permanent Representatives, basically the ambassadors who prep the final government decisions, they approved the controversial chat control proposal.
This is the one that's been advertised as voluntary scanning of private messages for illegal content. But privacy experts are, well, they're calling that a significant deception.
It's a coercive framework. Service providers, they're not explicitly mandated to scan, but they face mandatory mitigation obligations if they're deemed high risk.
And what's listed as an effective mitigation?
Explicitly, the use of voluntary scanning and age verification systems.
So the consequence is that to avoid being labeled high risk, providers will pretty much require mandatory age verification to reliably identify minors.
Which means that soon, using encrypted messaging, even on services like Signal or WhatsApp, could require all of us to upload IDs or undergo face scans. It fundamentally eliminates anonymity for everyone.
And we know how unreliable this technology is.
We do. Just look at the real-world data from similar systems. In 2024, Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office reported that of all the content reports they got, 99,375 out of about 205,000 were criminally irrelevant.
Wait, hold on. Nearly 48% of the reports they received were false positives.
Almost half.
So innocent people are having their private messages flagged and sent to law enforcement almost half the time.
Exactly. It is an infrastructure built on massive failure rates, yet it's being deployed globally. And this is the critical pattern of pretext that critics are always warning about. Systems built explicitly for child protection like mandatory age verification and content scanning, they create an infrastructure that can be easily expanded for broader, more authoritarian purposes.
Like eliminating anonymity and monitoring political speech.
That's a fear.
That shift from protecting kids to creating a permanent digital ID framework for everyone, that seems to be the central issue here.
So if Australia and the EU represent this decisive, high-tech, centralized action, the U.S. landscape, by comparison, it's just a fragmented, confusing, and constantly shifting maze of state laws.
Right. The federal baseline in the U.S. is still COPP, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. That only covers kids under 13. Once you get into teenagers, regulation becomes this state-level patchwork that is incredibly difficult for any company to comply with.
The lack of uniformity is the compliance killer. The definition of a minor just varies wildly across states, forcing online services to create these incredibly complex, dynamic, location-aware systems.
You're talking about defining a minor as 13 to 15 in California, 13 to 16 in Arkansas, and then under 18 in New York or Vermont.
Yeah, and service providers are juggling general consumer laws, specific age-appropriate design codes, and then outright social media regulations, like Florida's attempt at an under-14 ban. It's not about setting one standard. It's about serving a national audience under 50 different rulebooks.
And the most critical takeaway for the U.S. situation is the extreme legal volatility.
Yeah.
Unlike Australia, where the challenge is centralized in their high court, in the U.S., almost every major new state law in Arkansas, California, Florida, Utah, has been immediately challenged, blocked, or enjoined by the courts.
And the grounds for those blocks are almost always the same, right?
Yes, First Amendment grounds. They argue that restricting access or demanding ID verification is an illegal restriction on free speech. For instance, the Ohio law was blocked immediately. The court just called it constitutionally infirm.
The courts are basically saying these state laws are an overreach.
So on one hand, you have Australia and the EU building this irreversible infrastructure with strong, unified government action. On the other, the U.S. is just battling itself. State laws constantly on hold because federal courts are citing constitutional rights.
Yeah.
And for anyone trying to monitor compliance in that chaotic environment, knowing the moment a law is blocked or enjoined is vital. It really speaks volumes about the need for resources that track these specific legal shifts.
That's where the detail matters most, in the courts and in the implementation.
Okay, let's unpack this and synthesize what we've learned across these three continents. What really stands out to me is that the debate has universally shifted. It's no longer about if we should protect children. The global consensus is yes, of course. The fight is how the required enforcement mechanisms, especially this move toward mandatory age verification tied to real-world identity, impact the rights and the privacy of every other internet user.
That is the crux of the matter. And it highlights the inherent danger in trading fundamental rights for what is, perceived security. This makes the Australian High Court challenge so critical to watch.
Right.
If the court accepts the argument that a blanket ban violates that implied freedom of political communication, it sets a potent global precedent. It challenges the disproportionate means being used to achieve safety goals. It tells regulators everywhere they have to choose less restrictive alternatives.
It really seems like whether the Australian law stands or falls, the age verification and digital ID infrastructure, the actual technical framework, it's already being built globally under this banner of child protection. From the EU wallet to the AI biometrics used in Australia.
It's coming, one way or another.
Which raises a pretty sobering and provocative question for all of us. What content beyond political communication and social media access will be regulated next once this mandatory ID framework is fully in place for all Internet users?
A profound thought to consider as this all matures.
And for anyone needing to track this evolving global map of compliance, privacy laws, and regulatory actions, from the constitutional specifics in Australia to the mechanics of the digital wallet rollout in Europe, we rely on resources like www.compliancehub.wiki and www.myprivacy.blog.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into what is really the coming regulatory reality.
We'll see you next time.